Hello, and welcome to the APUSH Dig. Our topic to explore this week focuses on U.S. foreign policy at the very end of the 19th century, continuing into the first decades of the 20th century. Historians dub this era a period of U.S. imperialism, the creation of a global empire for the United States. But hadn't the United States always been an empire? A settler colonial empire marching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, constantly in conflict with indigenous peoples? And what about the outbreak of war with Mexico in 1846 and the taking of half of its land in 1848? You see, the U.S. had always employed the habits of empire. In this period of new imperialism, the United States would now expand on its imperial tendencies on the global stage. The big picture we want to understand is this. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, new United States imperial ambitions and acquisitions accompanied heightened debates over America's role in the world. It's clear that in this era, the U.S. had become a world power. We studied its economic, industrial rise during the Gilded Age. Now out on the world stage, the U.S. began to imitate the imperial tendencies of the European empires, such as Britain and France. What motivated this new phase of American empire? First was the desire to secure new markets for American products. And secondly, the desire to secure cheap access to raw industrial materials. Both of these motivations were economic. Politically, there was a desire to compete with the European nations' empires. And the belief was, for America to become powerful, it needed naval supremacy across the Pacific Ocean, linking the United States to Asia. The United States was going to need many naval bases and coaling stations, also naval bases in the Caribbean. Socially, there was a desire to spread Anglo-Saxon civilization, sometimes referred to as white man's burden. This was really more about white supremacy, white dominance, white norms. All of this in order to make U.S. business interests prosper globally. And finally, there's a theory that the frontier had closed, that part of the American philosophy and its myth was this idea that the frontier gave Americans meaning, that there was always opportunities to the West. But by the 1890s, North American West, it was closed. So where would the United States turn to next? Perhaps it's this restlessness that could be behind the propelling of the United States into war in 1898, the Spanish-American War. Two Spanish colonies were fighting for independence, Spain and the Philippines. The United States saw an opportunity to intervene. War was declared on Spain in 1898. But it's the effects of the war that are most important. After this war is over, the United States is victorious. Spain surrenders its claim to Cuba. Though Cuba does not become an official part of the United States, President McKinley and the military will supervise Cuba's transition from a colony of Spain to being independent. Really, Cuba will be part of the American business interests all the way up until the 1960s. Spain cedes Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Spain agrees to sell the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Combine this with the annexation of Hawaii, and the U.S. had officially become a colonial power. Look at this map. By 1900, we recognize the contiguous United States and North America. We also see the purchase of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. And then across the Pacific Ocean, we see Hawaii and all of these other islands that are now claimed by the United States. From American Samoa to Guam, all the way to the Philippines, these become like stepping stones to Asian markets and American business interests. Also, when we look in the Caribbean Sea, we see how the United States will exert hegemony over Cuba and will actually control Puerto Rico. Let's look at some examples of America's empire in this period. First off, let's look a little bit at the story of Hawaii. Hawaii was its own kingdom. In 1893, the Queen was overthrown by American business interests. Sanford Dole, that's right, of the Dole Fruit Company, names himself President of Hawaii. The President of the United States at the time concluded that the removal of the Queen was illegal and refused then to annex Hawaii to the United States. This changes later when the new President, McKinley, in 1898, annexes Hawaii and it officially becomes a territory of the United States. The Philippines was a Spanish colonial possession, and the Filipino people were rising up against Spanish misrule, all in favor of independence. The United States fought alongside Filipinos against the Spanish. But once the Spanish left, the United States had no intention of leaving. The Filipinos objected to the U.S. possession of the Philippines from Spain. So the Philippine-American War was a continuation of this Philippine struggle for independence. The war was declared over on the 4th of July, 1902, with a U.S. victory. It was not until the 1916 Philippine Autonomy Act passed by Congress that the U.S. officially promised eventual independence to the Philippines. It won't come until after World War II, in 1946, that the Philippines will officially be independent. Puerto Rico is an American colony that has never been independent. The Foraker Act of 1900 stated that Puerto Rico would be ruled by the military, and there would be a governor appointed by the President of the United States to oversee the island. The U.S. Congress retained the power to cancel any acts of the Puerto Rican legislature, so there was no democracy on Puerto Rico. In 1906, President Roosevelt recommended that Puerto Ricans become U.S. citizens, and today Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, and they elect their own governor. But Puerto Ricans today do not vote in our presidential elections. In 1914, the Puerto Rican House of Delegates voted unanimously in favor of independence from the United States, but this was of course rejected by the U.S. Congress and in violation of the Foraker Act. Puerto Rico remains a colony to this day. The United States was also involved with Mexico in this period. American businesses, especially oil businesses, were really invested. But the Mexican Revolution breaks out. Chaos breaks out. And chaos is not good for U.S. business interests. President Wilson at this time says he wants to stabilize Mexico and help Mexicans to elect good leaders, quote unquote. And he sends in U.S. Marines on 2 separate occasions. Wilson had thought that the Marines would be welcomed. However, most Mexicans were very upset at the sight of U.S. soldiers. Troops were eventually removed. So what changed in this era? Let's reflect on change during the era of new American imperialism, beginning in 1898. First, we have to understand that the U.S. becomes regarded as a global power as it annexed islands throughout the Pacific Ocean and Caribbean Sea. As the U.S. conquers and occupies land beyond North America, the same question keeps arising. Does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, do the conquered peoples receive the same rights as continental Americans? In what's known as the insular cases, the Supreme Court answers this question very clearly. No. People living in places like Puerto Rico and the Philippines will not receive the same rights as American citizens. Therefore, we can clearly see that there is no doubt the United States had become an empire, if it wasn't one already.